Imagine waking up in a world where running water doesn't exist, diseases are invisible predators, and even a trip outside your home could be a death sentence. Welcome to medieval times, a world that seems like something out of a dark fairy tale, but one where the monsters were very real, and you, unarmed and unprepared, probably wouldn't last a single day. Today, we're stepping into a period of history that was as brutal as it was fascinating. A time when your social status could decide whether you lived or died, when the food on your plate could kill you faster than a sword, and when the simplest task, walking down the street, was fraught with danger. This is not a story of kings and knights alone. This is a story of peasants, artisans, and ordinary people trying desperately to survive in a world that demanded both courage and cunning, or at least a fair bit of luck. So, buckle up. By the end of this journey, you may never look at history, or your modern life, the same way again. Let's begin with the streets. Picture yourself walking through a medieval town. The cobblestones are uneven, the smell is unforgettable, and the air carries a mixture of smoke, animal waste, and whatever is rotting in the marketplace. People call it life. You would call it terrifying. Sanitation? Almost non-existent. Chamber pots were emptied out the windows directly into the streets. Rainwater would mix with human and animal waste, creating a toxic soup that ran beneath your feet. A single misstep could land you in the muck, or worse, in a puddle teeming with pathogens that could make you seriously ill. Rats were everywhere, and they weren't just pests, they were carriers of the Black Death, which would sweep across Europe and kill tens of millions in the 14th century alone. Even walking wasn't safe. You had to dodge carts, horses, and occasionally, aggressive beggars or pickpockets. And towns were cramped, homes built close together, with no regulations on fire safety. A stray spark could turn an entire town into ashes in hours. If you thought about taking a stroll for leisure, you'd quickly rethink that idea. Next, we come to food. Eating in medieval times was an adventure, and often, a gamble with death. Most peasants survived on a diet of bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables they could grow. Meat was rare and reserved for the wealthy. What meat they did eat was often spoiled or infested. And without refrigeration, any mistake in storage could mean food poisoning, sometimes fatal. Even the rich were not safe. Spices were expensive and imported, often adulterated with harmful substances. People didn't understand germs, so dishes could be contaminated without anyone noticing. It wasn't uncommon for nobles to fall ill from their own lavish feasts. Imagine sitting down to a meal, thinking you're indulging, and suddenly finding yourself fighting off a deadly infection because someone didn't wash their hands. Or because the fish you just ate was spoiled. Hunger was another constant companion. Famine struck frequently due to poor harvests, war, or disease. A single bad year could kill thousands in a region. And it wasn't just starvation, it was malnutrition, weakness, and vulnerability to disease. If you weren't careful, medieval life could starve you out before anything else did. But it wasn't just the streets or food that threatened your survival. Work in medieval times was grueling, relentless, and often dangerous. Peasants spent long days in the fields with primitive tools, exposed to the elements, and without modern medicine to treat injuries. A simple cut could become infected and kill you. Even city laborers weren't safer. Blacksmiths risked burns, carpenters could lose fingers, and apprentices often faced brutal punishments if they made mistakes. Society was unforgiving. Crime, or even minor infractions, were met with severe consequences. Public punishments, like stocks, whipping posts, or execution, were common spectacles meant to instill fear, and they did. Hierarchy ruled everything. If you were a peasant, your life was dictated by the will of your lord. If you were a merchant, the whims of the guild controlled your livelihood. And if you were a woman, forget autonomy entirely. Your days were filled with labor, social rules, and expectations that could mean life or death if you stepped out of line. Now, let's talk about perhaps the most terrifying aspect of medieval life, disease. Imagine waking up one morning with a fever, a rash, or a sudden pain in your stomach. In today's world, you'd visit a doctor, take some medicine, maybe even get a test. In medieval times? You were largely on your own. Medical knowledge was limited, mystical, and often dangerous. People believed in the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were imbalanced, you might be subjected to leeches, bloodletting, or strange herbal concoctions. None of these treatments cured anything reliably, and some made conditions worse. Epidemics were regular nightmares. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, about a third of the population. Smallpox, typhoid, and dysentery were constant threats. Hygiene was rudimentary. Bathing was infrequent, and the idea that water could transmit disease was not understood. People thought that foul smells, or miasmas, caused sickness, so instead of cleaning, they often relied on perfumes and incense. Even minor injuries could be fatal. A cut, a burn, or even a broken bone could lead to infection and death, because antibiotics didn't exist. Hospitals were rare, crowded, and more like places to die than heal. If you survived the streets, the food, and the work, disease was waiting, silent, invisible, and relentless. So, if you think modern life is tough, remember, in medieval times, even a small scratch could become a death sentence. And that's just a warm-up. Survival wasn't just a matter of avoiding illness. Life was violent. Nobles fought in wars over lands and power, while peasants were drafted or raided as collateral damage. Imagine waking up to find your village burned, your food stolen, and your neighbors gone. This was a regular reality. Even outside battlefields, violence lurked everywhere. Bandits roamed poorly defended roads. Punishments for minor offenses were brutal and public. Beheading, hanging, breaking on the wheel, these were not just for criminals, sometimes they were tools to enforce loyalty, social order, or fear. And let's not forget the weapons. A sword, an axe, a pitchfork, ordinary tools that could become deadly in the wrong hands. Accidents were common. A single misstep while wielding a sword, or even carrying a load of wood, could mean a permanent injury or death. In crowded marketplaces, fights could break out for the smallest disputes, and law enforcement was inconsistent at best. Even social interactions were dangerous. Offending the wrong person, violating a strange law, or breaking custom could land you in trouble, or worse. Loyalty to your lord, adherence to your guild, and obedience to unwritten social codes were matters of survival. One wrong word in the wrong place, and your life could end violently. Medieval life was, in short, a minefield. Every step, every choice, every interaction had a cost, and the stakes were higher than we can imagine today. But survival in medieval times wasn't only about avoiding disease or violence. People had to navigate a world of bizarre customs and absurd laws, rules that seem unbelievable today, but were strictly enforced back then. For example, in some towns, there were laws about how long you could talk on the street, what colors you could wear based on your social class, and even when you could cut your hair. In England, sumptuary laws dictated that only the wealthy could wear certain fabrics or colors. Peasants who dared to dress like nobles could face fines, humiliation, or worse. And the strangest customs? Let's take food again. In parts of France, bread was so sacred that bakers could be punished for making it improperly, even by death. In Germany, people were fined for having too much or too little fat in their meals. Even religion shaped daily life to extremes. Fasting rules were strict, sometimes forcing people to survive on very little for long periods. Here's the plot twist. Despite all this danger, all this misery, medieval society produced incredible resilience, ingenuity, and creativity. The very hardships that would kill us today forced people to innovate. They built castles to survive invasions, developed early forms of sanitation, and created laws, trade, and social structures that laid the foundation for modern civilization. You see, if you think you wouldn't last a day in medieval times, it's true. You wouldn't. But the people who did survive weren't necessarily stronger, they were smarter, more observant, and more adaptable. And that adaptability is the real story we carry into the modern world. Every invention, every law, every medical advance we enjoy today is, in part, a reaction to a world that was terrifying, unpredictable, and often lethal. So, if you ever complain about traffic, fast food, or deadlines, remember, someone in medieval Europe was dealing with rats, plague, starvation, and the constant fear of being executed, all before breakfast. Now let's talk about castles, the iconic symbol of the medieval world. High stone walls, towers, moats, and iron gates. You'd think living inside a castle meant safety, but not really. For the servants, soldiers, and even nobles, a castle was less a fairy-tale palace and more like a crowded fortress. The air inside the great hall was thick with smoke from torches and fireplaces, with barely any ventilation. Imagine coughing through the haze while trying to eat your meal. The stone walls weren't cozy either, they dripped with moisture, so damp that moss could creep up the sides. And while castles were designed to keep enemies out, they also kept disease in. If one person got sick, the cramped quarters guaranteed that everyone else would soon be ill. So, if you think sleeping in a castle bed meant luxury, think again. You'd likely be scratching yourself from flea bites or trying not to gag from the smell of the chamber pots tucked under the bed. Safety, it turns out, was relative. Behind those mighty walls, you were just as vulnerable as anyone in a village hut, sometimes more so. When you hear medieval times, chances are you imagine knights in shining armor. But chivalry, the code of honor we associate with gallant knights, wasn't exactly what movies tell us. For one, armor was so heavy, up to 60 pounds, that wearing it all day was exhausting. And underneath, knights wore padded garments that trapped sweat, making the smell unbearable. After just a few hours, your skin would chafe, blister, and even rot in places that never got fresh air. And then there was the reality of tournaments. Knights weren't just jousting for fun, they were risking their lives. One wrong move and a broken lance could pierce through a visor or shatter bones. Even if you won, your body would ache for days. But here's the twist, chivalry wasn't really about honor. It was about control. Kings and lords used it to keep knights in line, to remind them who they served, and to glorify warfare. So, while you picture romance and roses, remember, chivalry often meant bleeding for your lord, not wooing a maiden under the moonlight. Getting sick in medieval times was one of the worst fates imaginable. Forget antibiotics, forget vaccines. Even the simplest infection, like a tooth abscess, could kill you. Doctors, or more accurately, barber surgeons, believed in the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were ill, they'd try to balance these humours, often by bleeding you with leeches or cutting open your veins. The result? Patients frequently died faster from the treatment than from the illness itself. Let's say you had the plague. The prescription? Carry herbs in your pocket, burn aromatic wood, or pray harder. Sometimes, physicians even recommended sitting next to a fire so the heat could sweat out the sickness. Unsurprisingly, none of this worked. And dentistry? Forget it. Toothache? The cure might be yanking it out with pliers, no anesthetic. If you screamed, well, that was just part of the process. So, in a world without modern medicine, you wouldn't just fear the disease, you'd fear the cure. Now imagine you're accused of a crime in medieval Europe. Maybe you stole a loaf of bread, or maybe your neighbor just doesn't like you. What happens? Justice was brutal and often arbitrary. Trials by jury were rare. Instead, you might face trial by ordeal. Want to prove your innocence? You'd be forced to plunge your hand into boiling water or walk across red-hot iron. If your wounds healed cleanly, you were innocent. If not, guilty. Sometimes, you'd be thrown into a river with your hands tied. If you floated, that meant the water had rejected you, you were guilty. If you sank, well, you were innocent, but also drowned. And punishments? They were designed less to reform and more to terrify others. Public executions were community events, with families bringing their children to watch. Hangings, beheadings, burnings at the stake, all were meant to make an example. So no, medieval justice wasn't about fairness. It was about control, fear, and keeping order in a dangerous world. Now, here's the part we don't always hear. Despite all the horrors, medieval life wasn't only suffering. People laughed, loved, and celebrated. Festivals lit up the calendar, from Christmas feasts to spring carnivals. Music filled the taverns, and even peasants danced after a long day in the fields. Storytellers roamed from town to town, spinning tales of dragons, saints, and faraway lands. Children played with simple toys, wooden dolls, hoops, and carved animals. Families gathered to share stories by firelight, their version of television. And art flourished. Monks illuminated manuscripts with breathtaking designs, even if most of the population couldn't read them. Cathedrals rose, their stained glass windows glowing like jewels when the sun hit just right. So yes, life was hard. But it wasn't joyless. Humans, even then, found reasons to smile. Now, as for religion in the medieval times, it wasn't just a Sunday affair, it was everything. The church dictated not only how people prayed but how they lived, worked, and even thought. Want to eat meat on a Friday? Forbidden. Want to question church teachings? Dangerous. Entire villages revolved around the local parish, and people donated what little they had in hopes of saving their souls from eternal damnation. But faith wasn't only about hope, it was also about fear. The threat of hellfire and eternal punishment was a constant shadow over daily life. Pilgrimages to holy sites were common, sometimes stretching hundreds of miles on foot. People sought relics, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, believing they held miraculous powers. For the poor, religion gave comfort. For the powerful, it was a tool of control. And if you dared to defy it, you risked being branded a heretic, sometimes with fatal consequences. If you lived in medieval Europe, war wasn't an occasional event, it was a constant possibility. Lords and kings fought endlessly over land, taxes, and thrones. For peasants, war meant devastation. Armies marching through your village would strip it bare, taking food, livestock, and even burning homes. Soldiers weren't paid well, so looting was their way of surviving. And if you were unlucky, you could be conscripted into the fight yourself, handed a spear, and shoved into a battle you didn't understand. And the battles? They were brutal. Muddy fields slick with blood, arrows raining down, and screams echoing for hours. No medics, no safe zones. If you were injured, your chances of survival were slim. To live in medieval times meant always bracing yourself for conflict, whether you carried a sword or not. Science as we know it didn't exist. So how did people explain sickness, bad weather, or crop failures? Through superstition. Witches were blamed for illnesses. Demons were believed to lurk in the forests. If lightning struck your barn, neighbors whispered that someone had cursed you. Amulets and charms were worn for protection, rabbit's feet, herbs, and crosses. Astrology played a huge role, too. Kings and nobles often consulted astrologers before making big decisions, believing the stars dictated their fates. Even simple things, like sneezing, were thought to be spiritual. That's why people said, "God bless you," to protect against evil spirits. In a world with so little control, superstition gave people a sense of explanation, even if it was terrifying. Eating in medieval times wasn't about pleasure, it was about survival. The poor lived mostly on bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables they could grow. Meat was rare, reserved for the wealthy. Famine struck often. A bad harvest meant starvation. Entire families might go hungry through the winter, boiling weeds or grinding acorns into flour to survive. And if you thought medieval food was healthier, think again. Bread could be filled with ground-up bark or spoiled grains. Sometimes it carried mold that produced hallucinations, leading to mass hysteria. Meanwhile, the nobility feasted on roasted boars, venison, and exotic spices imported at great cost. Banquets were as much about showing off wealth as they were about eating. So when you picture medieval dining, remember, one man's feast was another man's famine. One surprising truth about medieval times is that survival wasn't just individual, it was communal. Villages worked together to plant, harvest, and defend themselves. Neighbors shared tools, bread, and labor. Without this cooperation, life would have been impossible. Festivals weren't only for joy, they strengthened bonds. When the harvest came in, everyone celebrated, because everyone's survival depended on it. Even marriages were often strategic, tying families and farms together to ensure security. So while the medieval world was cruel, it was also deeply interconnected. Community was your lifeline. So now you know, life in medieval times was not the romantic tale of knights and castles we often imagine. It was a world where the air was thick with disease, where superstition explained the stars, and where survival meant clinging to your community, your faith, and sometimes sheer luck. Could you survive a day? The truth is, most of us couldn't. The food alone might poison us, the punishments would horrify us, and the lack of medicine would undo us in hours. But those who lived then didn't see themselves as unlucky. They adapted, endured, and found joy even in the shadow of famine and war. And here's the twist, medieval times never truly vanished. Their echoes live on in our superstitions, in the gaps between rich and poor, in our fears of disease, and even in the way we gather around stories to make sense of the world. So the next time you sit at a table filled with food, or step into a hospital when you're sick, or complain about the weight of a deadline instead of armor, remember, you're already carrying the lessons of medieval survival. You wouldn't last a day back then, but in many ways, you're living their legacy now. That's why the medieval world isn't just history. It's the foundation of the world we know. And a reminder of just how far, and yet how little, we've truly come.